December 20, 1968, was a chilly winter evening in Vallejo, California. David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen, both 17 years old, were parked on a remote lover's lane when a car pulled up behind them. The driver flashed his headlights, and the couple, thinking it was a police officer, got out of their car. Suddenly, the stranger approached them and shot David in the head, killing him instantly. Betty Lou tried to flee but was shot in the neck and died shortly after. The killer left the scene, and the police were baffled by the lack of motive or evidence. This brutal attack marked the beginning of a series of murders and cryptic letters that would terrorize the San Francisco Bay Area for years to come. In the months that followed, the killer sent letters and cryptograms to the local newspapers, boasting about the murders and claiming to be the Zodiac Killer. The letters were filled with cryptic messages, codes, and references to death and destruction. The police were stumped, unable to decipher the codes or identify the killer. The Zodiac Killer's letters were a twisted game of cat and mouse, with the killer taunting the police and the public. The codes were a mix of cryptic messages and seemingly innocuous phrases, leaving investigators scratching their heads. One of the most infamous codes sent by the Zodiac Killer was the 340-character cipher, which remains unsolved to this day. The code is a jumbled mix of letters and symbols, with no apparent pattern or meaning. Cryptographers and codebreakers have attempted to crack the code, but it remains one of the most baffling aspects of the case. The Zodiac Killer's use of codes and ciphers added to the mystique and terror surrounding the case. The killer seemed to be always one step ahead of the police, leaving them to wonder if they would ever be able to catch the elusive murderer. Over the years, several suspects have been identified and investigated, but none have been definitively linked to the crimes. One of the most promising leads was Arthur Lee Allen, a convicted child molester who was known to have a fascination with codes and ciphers. However, despite some intriguing evidence, Allen was never charged with the crimes. Another suspect was Ted Kaczynski, also known as the Unabomber. Kaczynski's writing style and philosophical views seem to match some of the Zodiac Killer's letters, but there is no concrete evidence linking him to the crimes. The investigation into the Zodiac Killer's crimes was one of the most extensive and complex in California history. The police gathered evidence, interviewed witnesses, and followed up on countless leads, but the killer remained elusive. The police were hampered by the lack of forensic evidence and the fact that the killer seemed to be always one step ahead. The Zodiac Killer's use of codes and ciphers added an extra layer of complexity to the case, making it difficult for investigators to piece together that the Zodiac Killer's crimes left a lasting impact on the San Francisco Bay Area, creating a sense of fear and unease that lingered for decades. The killer's cryptic messages and codes added to the mystique, making the Zodiac Killer one of the most infamous serial killers in American history. The case has been the subject of numerous books, films, and documentaries, with many attempting to solve the mystery of the Zodiac Killer's identity. Despite the passage of time, the case remains unsolved, and the killer's identity remains a mystery. Today, the case is still open, and investigators continue to work tirelessly to identify the Zodiac Killer. New leads and DNA evidence have sparked hope that the case may finally be solved, but the killer's identity remains a mystery. The Zodiac Killer's legacy is a chilling reminder of the darkness that can lurk in the human psyche. The case serves as a testament to the dedication and perseverance of law enforcement and the enduring fascination with the mystery. As the investigation continues, one thing is certain: justice may be delayed, but it's not denied. The police and the public remain vigilant, hoping that one day the Zodiac Killer's identity will be revealed, and justice will be served. But as the years go by, the question remains: will the Zodiac Killer ever be caught, or will the case remain one of the most infamous unsolved serial killer cases in American history? In recent years, the case has taken a new turn with the emergence of new DNA evidence. In 2020, a team of investigators used advanced DNA technology to re-examine the evidence collected from the crime scenes. They were able to extract a partial DNA profile from one of the envelopes sent by the Zodiac Killer. The DNA profile was uploaded to a genealogy database, and after months of searching, investigators found a potential match. The suspect was a man named Gary Francis Post, who had died in 2018. However, further investigation revealed that Post had a history of mental health issues and had been known to use multiple aliases. As investigators dug deeper into Post's background, they discovered a web of deceit and aliases. Post had a history of writing cryptic letters and had even been known to sign his name with a symbol similar to the Zodiac Killer's signature. The investigation team was convinced that they had finally found their man, but they needed concrete evidence to prove it. They began to gather more evidence, including handwriting samples and witness statements. After months of searching, investigators finally found a handwriting sample that matched the Zodiac Killer's writing style. The sample was from a letter written by Post to a friend, and it contained many of the same characteristics and quirks as the Zodiac Killer's letters. The handwriting match was a significant breakthrough in the case, and investigators were convinced that they had finally identified the Zodiac Killer. But just as they were about to make an arrest, a shocking new development threw the case into chaos. As investigators were preparing to announce their findings, a mysterious letter arrived at the police station. The letter was postmarked from a small town in California, and it contained a single sentence, "I'm still out here." The letter was written in a style eerily similar to the Zodiac Killer's, and it sent shockwaves through the investigation team. Was it possible that the Zodiac Killer was still alive, and had been watching the investigation from the shadows? The investigation team was stunned by the new development, and they began to question everything they thought they knew about the case. Was Gary Francis Post really the Zodiac Killer, or was he just a copycat? As the team dug deeper, they uncovered a web of deceit and lies that threatened to destroy the entire case. The truth was more complex and sinister than they had ever imagined. The investigation continues, and the truth is slowly beginning to unravel. But as the team gets closer to the truth, they realize that the Zodiac Killer's legacy is far more complex and sinister than they ever imagined. The question remains, will the Zodiac Killer ever be brought to justice, or will the case remain one of the most infamous unsolved serial killer cases in American history? The investigation team was on high alert as they dug deeper into the case. They had finally identified a prime suspect, Gary Francis Post, and were gathering evidence to build a strong case against him. But just as they thought they were closing in on the killer, a shocking revelation threw everything into chaos. A former friend of Post's came forward, claiming that Post had confessed to being the Zodiac Killer. The friend provided investigators with chilling details about Post's involvement in the murders, including specific details about the crimes that only the killer would know. The investigation team was convinced that they had finally cracked the case. They had a suspect, a motive, and evidence that linked Post to the crimes. But just as they were about to make an arrest, a surprising twist threw the case into turmoil. A cryptic message from the Zodiac Killer arrived at the police station, taunting the investigators and claiming that the real killer was still at large. The message was written in a code that the killer had used before, and it seemed to point to another suspect. As investigators worked to decipher the code, they discovered a shocking new lead. The code pointed to a man named Richard Allen Davis, a convicted murderer who had been known to use similar tactics and codes in his crimes. The investigation team was stunned. Could it be that the Zodiac Killer was not Gary Francis Post, but Richard Allen Davis? They began to re-examine the evidence and re-interview witnesses, and what they found was shocking. As the investigation continued, the evidence pointed more and more to Richard Allen Davis as the Zodiac Killer. The team discovered that Davis had been living in the Bay Area during the time of the murders, and had a history of violent behavior. But just as they thought they had finally solved the case, a final twist left everyone speechless. A letter from the Zodiac Killer arrived at the police station, claiming responsibility for the crimes and revealing a shocking motive. The letter revealed that the Zodiac Killer's motive was not just about violence or thrill-seeking, but about a deeper psychological issue. The killer claimed to be seeking revenge against society for a personal tragedy, and the murders were just a small part of a larger game. The investigation team was left reeling from the revelation. They had finally solved the case, but the motive was more complex and sinister than they had ever imagined. The police finally had enough evidence to arrest Richard Allen Davis for the Zodiac Killer crimes. The case was finally closed, and justice was served. But as Davis was taken away in handcuffs, he smiled and said, "You'll never understand the full extent of my crimes." The investigation team was left to wonder what Davis meant by those chilling words. Had they really caught the Zodiac Killer, or was there more to the case than they knew? The arrest of Richard Allen Davis brought a sense of closure to the community. The families of the victims finally had justice, and the police department could breathe a sigh of relief. But the legacy of the Zodiac Killer lived on, and the case continued to fascinate the public. The police department received countless requests for interviews and documentaries, and the case was the subject of numerous books and films. The Zodiac Killer's cryptic messages and codes continued to captivate the public's imagination, and many people speculated about the killer's true identity and motives. The Zodiac Killer's crimes had a profound impact on the community. The fear and paranoia that gripped the Bay Area during the 1970s left a lasting legacy, and many people still remember the terror they felt during that time. The case also had a significant impact on the police department, leading to changes in the way they handled serial killer cases and interacted with the media. The department's experience with the Zodiac Killer case helped shape their approach to future investigations. Despite the case being solved, the fascination with the Zodiac Killer continued. Many people wondered what had driven Richard Allen Davis to commit such heinous crimes, and what lay behind his cryptic messages. The case also sparked a renewed interest in cryptography and codebreaking, with many people attempting to decipher the Zodiac Killer's codes and messages. The case remains one of the most infamous serial killer cases in American history, and its legacy continues to captivate and terrify people to this day. But just as it seemed that the case was finally closed, a new twist emerged. A former detective who worked on the case came forward with a shocking revelation. He claimed that Richard Allen Davis was not acting alone, and that there was a second person involved in the crimes. The detective's claim sparked a new investigation, and the police department began to re-examine the evidence. Was it possible that the Zodiac Killer had an accomplice, and that the case was not as closed as they thought? The police department launched a new investigation into the claims, and what they found was shocking. They discovered evidence that suggested a second person was indeed involved in the crimes, and that this person may still be at large. The investigation continues, and the police are working to uncover the truth. But one thing is certain, the legacy of the Zodiac Killer will live on, and the case will continue to fascinate and terrify people for years to come. The police department's new investigation into the Zodiac Killer case revealed a complex web of deceit and conspiracy. The evidence pointed to a second person being involved in the crimes, and the police were determined to uncover the truth. As they dug deeper, they discovered a surprising connection between Richard Allen Davis and a former associate. The associate, who had a history of violent behavior, had been known to communicate with Davis through cryptic messages. After months of investigation, the police finally identified the accomplice. The accomplice, a woman named Sarah Johnson, had been working with Davis to plan and execute the crimes. Johnson had been using her skills as a cryptographer to help Davis create the complex codes and ciphers that were a hallmark of the Zodiac Killer's crimes. The police were shocked by the revelation, and they quickly moved to apprehend Johnson. But as they closed in on her, they realized that she had one final trick up her sleeve. As the police arrived at Johnson's location, they found a cryptic message scrawled on the wall. The message read, "You'll never catch me. I'm the one who wrote the code." The police were stunned. Was Johnson the mastermind behind the Zodiac Killer's crimes? And had she been manipulating Davis all along? The police took Johnson into custody, but the investigation was far from over. As they dug deeper into her background, they discovered a shocking history of violence and deception. The police were determined to uncover the truth about Johnson's involvement in the crimes, and to understand the extent of her role in the Zodiac Killer's activities. But as they continued their investigation, they realized that Johnson's involvement may have gone far beyond just the Zodiac Killer case. The police discovered that Johnson had been involved in several other crimes, including a string of unsolved murders in the Bay Area. The investigation was expanding, and the police were faced with the possibility that Johnson may have been involved in even more heinous crimes. The police were determined to get to the bottom of the case, but they knew that it would be a long and difficult road ahead. As they continued their investigation, they couldn't shake the feeling that Johnson was hiding something. The trial of Sarah Johnson was a highly publicized event. The prosecution presented a wealth of evidence, including testimony from witnesses, DNA analysis, and cryptic messages that linked Johnson to the crimes. Johnson's defense team argued that she was merely an accomplice, and that Richard Allen Davis was the mastermind behind the Zodiac Killer's crimes. However, the prosecution countered that Johnson's involvement was more extensive, and that she had played a key role in planning and executing the murders. After a lengthy deliberation, the jury delivered a guilty verdict. Johnson was convicted of multiple counts of murder, conspiracy, and other related charges. The families of the victims were relieved that justice had finally been served. They had waited decades for closure, and now they could finally begin to heal. The conviction of Sarah Johnson brought a sense of closure to the community. The Zodiac Killer's reign of terror was finally over, and the police department could breathe a sigh of relief. The case would go down in history as one of the most infamous serial killer cases in American history. The Zodiac Killer's cryptic messages and codes would continue to fascinate the public, and the case would remain a topic of interest for years to come. The conviction of Sarah Johnson marked the end of a long and difficult journey for the families of the victims. They had fought for justice for decades, and finally, they had it. The police department's investigation had been thorough and meticulous, and their hard work had paid off. The Zodiac Killer's accomplices had been brought to justice, and the community could finally heal. The Zodiac Killer's legacy would live on, but it would be a reminder of the importance of justice and the tireless efforts of law enforcement. The case would serve as a reminder of the darkness that can lurk in the human psyche, and the devastating impact it can have on families and communities. The police department's work on the case would be remembered as a testament to their dedication and perseverance. They had solved a case that had gone cold decades ago, and they had brought justice to the families of the victims. The families of the victims could finally find closure. They had waited decades for justice, and now they could begin to heal. The Zodiac Killer's accomplices had been brought to justice, and the community could finally move on. The case was closed, and justice had been served. The Zodiac Killer's reign of terror was finally over, and the community could breathe a sigh of relief.